welcome to SIIMCast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging, Informatics, and Medicine.
Hello again, listeners. This is Arjun, and I'm with co-host Prasanth and Jason. This episode serves as the first in a series of episodes introducing listeners to the SIIM Hackathon. We have a number of guests who have participated in SIIM Hackathons in the past, including Mohanad Hussain, Dr. Les Folio, and Dr. Howard Chen. Mohanad Hussain is the technical project manager of the SIIM Hackathon. He is a big proponent of modern healthcare standards such as FHIR.com Web and IHE Sol, as well as open source software in general, and in imaging informatics specifically. I want to particularly thank him for helping arrange this series looking at the hackathon. Dr. Folio is the lead radiologist for CT at the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland. He is clinical professor of radiology for the George Washington University Hospital. He's a retired colonel from the U.S. Air Force and was chair of radiology at the Osan Air Base when it became the first military base to transition from field to PAX in the early 1990s. He helped lead in medical informatics and science and technology at the Pentagon and also helped shape imaging informatics in deployed settings. Dr. Chen was on the most recent episode, so I won't belabor his introduction other than to say he is the Associate Informatics Officer at Cleveland Clinic Imaging Institute. Also joining with us is Arseny Semen, developer at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. Let's get started.
First, I'd like to introduce everybody to what the SIIM Hackathon looks like nowadays. So if we were to look at a 2,000-foot view of what the hackathon is these days, we could essentially break it down into 4 parts. So the first part is the day before the SIIM annual meeting kicks off, and that's the hackathon kickoff meeting. So this is where we have the hackathon participants, our mentors, whom we like to call code heroes, our committee members, and other people from the general SIIM community who are curious, people from the standard community, and so on and so forth, come and brainstorm ideas. So we sit together in a room for about an hour and a half, depending how long the discussion takes. We've got whiteboards, we've got people bringing up ideas, people suggesting solutions, people saying, hey, have you tried this IHE profile to solve this problem? Allow people to formulate teams. And as you're going to hear from Les, that was a nice opportunity for he and his collaborators to form a team that literally came from different walks of life in different parts of the world. But anyway, the kickoff meeting is something I highly recommend to anybody in the SIIM community who's curious about the SIIM Hackathon. It's a very nice experience where you get to meet a whole lot of people and hear some pretty cool ideas about how to improve healthcare. On the first day of SIIM, we open up the Hackathon headquarters, which is basically a space. Sometimes it's in the exhibit hall, sometimes it's one of the hallways. It's basically where the participants, the SIIM Hackathon participants, can sit down and do their work. It's also where the code heroes, aka mentors, make themselves available so they can help the participants answer questions, figure out, design patterns, solutions to problems they're having with, things like DICOM Web and FHIR, and so on and so forth. For people who are curious about the hackathon and could not make it to the kickoff meeting, you're also welcome to come and visit the hackathon headquarters. So it opens up on the first day of SIIM, of the annual meeting, and it stays open until the Hackathon Project Showcase, which is on the third day of SIIM. I'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, at any point, feel free to stop by. You'll see some participants hacking away on their laptops. Code heroes, feel free to introduce yourself to anybody, ask them questions about what they're doing, that kind of stuff. And then the second day of the SIIM conference is usually when we have the social. So I'm not going to dig too deep into that, but basically the idea is people come and catch a much needed break. We'll have drinks, finger food, people can socialize, mingle. We invite people from the outer SIIM community as well, so usually co-chairs of different SIIM committees, people from the standards community, and so on and so forth. And everybody gets to talk and make meaningful connections. And then last but not least, on the third day of SIIM, we'll usually have what we call the project showcase. So this is where the participants come and show the results of their work. We'll usually have judges and, of course, the audience. So the judges will pick one winner, and then the audience will pick another winner. So we'll have 2 awards in total. And it's, again, for somebody who's curious about the hackathon, a very nice session to attend because in an hour and a half, you get to see the fruit of the work that the participants have been doing for the last 2.5 days. Now, a couple of things that the audience should know about the hackathon is our hackathon, the SIIM Hackathon, is not the typical stereotypical hackathon that you hear about and see on TV. This is not a fiercely competitive hackathon. You don't see people drinking energy drinks. You don't see people taking naps on the floor. People here are very relaxed. You'll see people walking in and out of the hackathon headquarters as needed. It is SIIM after all, so it's a very educational experience. We encourage everybody to go and attend sessions and increase their learnings, come back and hack as they please, which also means that the judging for hackathon participants when they showcase the project is different than other hackathons. So we do not judge them on how polished and finished their product looks like. It's actually quite the opposite. We usually tell them it's okay if your demo blows up halfway through the presentation, or if it still looks like wireframe, that's perfectly acceptable. What we're looking for is the fact that you had an idea or a problem you want to solve, and that you've made a stride towards solving that problem. So again, wireframe or half-working prototype is perfectly fine. And again, we encourage everybody to come visit the hackathon, whether you're technical or clinical or you're just simply curious. Hackathon is a great place to be. People who are technical can be paired with people who are clinical or the opposite. And of course, people who are curious are also very welcome, whether you're curious to just see what's being worked on at the hackathon, or you're curious to try your hands with a little bit of DICOM Web and or Fire, maybe IHE Soul. It's also a good place for you to learn. That said, I'll pass it back to the hosts.
Thank you so much, Mohamed. I think rather than trying to do a round of questions right now, why don't we move on to Les, who did talk about his project on the webinar. But if you can tell us a little bit more over here today, then we'll go to Howard after that before we start asking kind of questions about the different projects in particular and then the hackathon in general.
Yeah, you mentioned my project and appreciate that, but it was a team effort. Yeah, Alejandra and Arseny were key to this and really the main drivers. I feel like I'm more of the network or connector that has an informatics technical background for a doctor, but often the translator between the engineers and what is needed from the clinicians. And that's what I've done in the past in the Pentagon. So how it came about at the meeting that first evening, I'd showed on the webinar how folks were how they still had their luggage in the room. I don't think Mohamed saw me with my energy drink napping on the floor. He said it wasn't that fierce, but no, really it wasn't. And folks were just beat from flying in, but the fact that their luggage was still there and they were still on the whiteboards. And after the introduction that Mohamed gave, then one of the keys was the discussion period after that, where Code Heroes and other hackathon committee folks and others got to chime in. And one of the things I mentioned was the need for annotations and the need for measurements in everyday radiologist workflow. For myself, for example, at NIH, we measure lesions every day. I measure 300 in a day easily. And these are annotations that are being done, used to be done by me. Now they're done by what we call radiology preprocessors, and soon will be done fully automatically, where AI machine learning will be measuring these for us. But how to get to that point is the need for more annotations. And although we have our own collection here, it would be nice if we had annotations from every radiologist that's reading radiology images or dermatologist that might annotate lesions. Then after that discussion period where I had mentioned this need, Alejandra and Diego approached me. Well, people just got together and as we were sitting down, we're forming their teams. And I think that was kind of the magic moment when Arseny was also working on something similar. Diego had made that connection, connected us with Alejandra, and then it just started to take off. We had a name, an idea to make a game to incentivize annotations through a crowdsourcing type of mechanism that we ended up calling Paxman. I think that was probably my biggest contribution to that. I put the dash after the Pac, since Pac-Man, and then the S was then making Pax, which was what we do every day in radiology, our window to imaging, picture archiving communication system, Pax, so Pax-Man. In any case, that was exciting. And then Alejandra or Arseny then added game on the first slide. And it just took off. It was mostly Arseny and Alejandra, you saw them everywhere with laptops open, and we would, whether it was in the hackathon headquarters or the dedicated room where it was an inviting environment, the original room where we had the introduction, had refreshments and presentations, ad hoc, just folks coming in the room and seeing how the hackathoners were going about their projects. For example, Kirk Langlots came in and started talking and drew an audience, and everyone stopped what they were doing, and he was encouraging everyone that how important this was to the mission of SIIM, but at the same time, a nice byproduct. I mean, in my case, it's my favorite part of SIIM. The first year, I believe, was in Pittsburgh several years ago. I was, like many, saying, what is this all about? It sounds interesting. And I was trying to download. First, I was getting my API key, figuring out the Wi-Fi, and downloading Postman, and a little bit lost. But that's how I've spent a lot of my educational career in studying physics and calculus and other things to prepare for medical school, but a welcoming challenge. But I was mostly a spectator in the prior years, and this year I was fortunate to be a part of this team. They had this nothing's impossible attitude and went for it, and I myself was getting goosebumps, especially when the live demo worked and they were painting, and Arseny overpainted the gallbladder to show that he got a B. The grading system is pretty lenient, but the leaderboard, for example, are interesting results that we're still talking about. When Tom O'Sullivan showed his presentation after ours, the soulmates, the fact that we were soul compliant was definitely a big advantage, and actually was talked about quite a bit on the webinar. And so I've learned more about how important that is.
I'm Arseny. I'm one of the developers for the Paxman project along with Alejandra. I mean, Les kind of already mentioned this, but definitely the hackathon is probably the most fun I have at SIIM, and also kind of the thing I value the most, or I feel like I learn from the most whenever I participate. But I don't know if there's any particular questions about what went into the programming half of bringing the Paxman project together. I'd be happy to answer those and talk about that kind of thing.
All right, Les and Arseny, thank you so much for that. And then let's hear from Howard before we kind of do some questions.
Yeah, so I think while Les had been involved in the hackathon, the Paxman project was just this past year. My involvement as a hackathon participant was a little bit further back. The year was I think it was 2016 in Portland. And the hackathon project overall had started, I believe it's probably the second or third year that it has started. And a lot of the teams were still a little bit unsure and just getting started with the Fire and DICOM Web APIs. For my project at the time, there was a theme that year in 2016. The theme was enterprise image capture, and with some focus on the enterprise imaging side of things. And something I have wondered whether, there are so many media, videos and images that are captured by the patients and in their own lives, and every once in a while it gets documented. Let's say somebody falls off a bike or somebody gets an injury while skateboarding, and then they go to the emergency room, and it has this strange dichotomy where, number one, it's basically the best information you have because it shows you exactly how this patient got injured, but at the same time it's not acquired with a CT, MRI. It's not acquired by a physician on their mobile phone, like a point of care mobile capture. So it's actually information that you can't bring into the EMR with today's system. And so something that I thought about would be interesting when we talk about enterprise image capture would be a way to bring in media from other sources of media. So the project at the end of the day ended up getting called, it didn't really have a name on its own, the hackathon presentation. I called it social media correlation recommended, kind of like clinical correlation recommended, but this time you do it on social media. The way the project is set up is that it would be a product that assimilates information from the social media and brings it into the PACS system and the VNA, into the VNA essentially. The social media of choice on that one was Vine, which has now, today in 2019, been put in archive status, so it's no longer active. But the whole purpose of picking that was because it has short videos, short 6 seconds segment videos, and I felt that it would be an easy proof of concept to perform even live, so that you don't have to wait for a YouTube video, for example, in the setting of a unreliable Wi-Fi connection. That could be your whole presentation waiting for a YouTube video to load. So the project, initially started out as an idea that I had discussed with Brad General, and who now works at NVIDIA, and got a lot of his insight on how DICOM is structured in the DICOM web. And at that time, I had never worked with the DICOM web API. In fact, I was very unfamiliar with the DICOM standard at the time. And all I knew was that it had images and it has a lot of quote unquote stuff that goes around the images that make it really difficult to process and upload. And for a while, I tried with the Hackathon stack and the DICOM web API, and I couldn't get the server to accept any of the data file because and I wasn't sure exactly what was wrong with it. So actually, two groups of people were extremely helpful. One is the Hackathon staff. So Mohanan, who helped a lot on the server side and the VNA side to show me how it's supposed to work, and Brad gave me a lot of insight on how the DICOM API is meant to ingest data, and how it's a stateless function. You're supposed to code it and communicate with it, get your token, and so on. And then the other group that have been really helpful was actually a guy in the name of Manabu Tokunaga, who was very experienced in DICOM, and he was also a hackathon participant that year. And we saw each other sort of working on each other's projects. We got started talking, and I just said to him, I can't figure out how to get this thing to upload to the VNA. And he said, actually, I have just a thing that could help you. So I actually got a lot of help from him and his insight onto how to wrap DICOM headers around image data of arbitrary format, and then communicate with the DICOM server. How do you actually use the Wado Keto kind of a mechanism to do it? So this project actually ends up getting a lot of love from not just SIIM through the Hackathon committee and co-heroes, but also from fellow Hackathon participants. Because at the end of the day, I think Mahana mentioned this earlier as well, it is a competition, but it's a bit more of a collegial competition, and we want each other to be able to put out your best foot forward rather than kind of a zero-sum game. So that's what I love about the hackathon, the SIIM hackathon. And people still drink coffee and energy drinks and so on, certainly not to the level of what you might expect in a college or university hackathon or a professional hackathon. But this is how I preferred it. At the end of the day, this project got runner-up, so second place grand prize for that year. And that's where we stand. The project itself was developed in Python. It had nothing, but on the first day, right? So just an idea on the first day for the discussion, has some prototype by the second day, and by the day before the presentation. And then on the day of the presentation, basically it was sort of wrapped around it with the presentation with an example. We got an example for Vine, off Vine, and uploaded it and proved that this works. And for the actual presentation on the day of the hackathon, actually, it was a live demo. There were two things involved in the demo. One is really just a presentation stack, like a slide deck on PowerPoint. And then the live demo itself had two subcomponents. One is the sort of curated part, where I just pull something out of Vine that I knew would work, and I had tested that it would work. And then the second part is I took a live video of the audience and the judges during the presentation. I uploaded it onto the social media platform and then pull it back out and put it into the VNA with the hackathon project as a live demo. So that was the presentation, and ended up having a lot of fun. That was quite an experience.
So I guess I have a question here. So it sounds like, Howard, you were a team of one. I don't know. You definitely relied on people's help. Okay, but you were a team of one. And how did that compare with some of the other teams that you were competing against? Did they have teams of one as well, or was it large teams that you were going up against?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's a full spectrum. So that year, the Cleveland Clinic had, I think, 3 people with an additional person join their team. So a team of 4. The person that won was a person. So actually, interesting, in 2016, the winner, I believe, was also a single person project. Peter Kemmel was the winner. And so it's a full spectrum, I think. There were several one-person team, and then there were some sort of larger teams. The person I got a lot of help from, Manabu, also competed as a solitary hacker that year.
Okay, perfect. I'll just follow up with one additional question, maybe open to the group a bit. But how do these teams form? So are they kind of pre-planned teams that we already know going in before I visit the SIIM, we know we're going in with this team, or do we have opportunities where the team is established and built right during the actual conference itself or day one?
I can speak to this a little bit because I participated in the hackathon 3 times. The first 2 times the teams were pretty much preformed. I came with coworkers. One of my other coworkers was either a dev or somebody else who was technical. We just sort of paired up, came up with an idea, developed it, and then presented it at the end of the conference. The first year it was a Slack bot, and then the second year it was kind of like a CAPTCHA, but for DICOM images. So this most recent year, the last one, was very much an exception for me, where I didn't really have any project partners from the get-go. And so I just came up with my own idea, and I kind of had every intention of just working on my own. But then Diego happened to pop by. Diego was one of the code heroes, pop by and asked me what it was that I was writing. And upon describing it to him, he sort of realized that this resembled what Alejandro was already working on very closely. And from there, I mean, we completely didn't know each other, but we described our 2 projects, I guess, to one another, realized that, yeah, for sure, this is like a no-brainer collaboration. I mean, if we worked on them separately, we'd be presenting the same thing twice, but as 2 different teams. So then that kind of pairing came and things went from there.
Can I ask, what's like the value proposition for the different types of people who come and try to join a team? It sounds like for some people, they want to get experience with, using Fire or Soul or these different standards, or they just want to get to work with other people and get a little bit better. Maybe a developer would come in with that kind of thing. Howard, it sounds like you had an idea for a specific project you actually wanted to try to develop. I'm not sure if that's fair to say. Mohamed was, we're trying to recruit more people to come and join these teams. Like, what would a clinician be bringing to the table, or what could they hope to get out of the experience?
I think Hackathon's value proposition is many-fold. For me personally, I had some very vague idea of a concept coming into that very, sort of before the SIIM meeting. The day before, there was that large group discussion. So I had a very vague idea going in, and the discussion helped me solidify that concept. I am a clinician that has coding background and willing to sort of quote unquote mess around with the standards. And I wanted to learn the DICOM Web or the Fire API, at least pick one of those during the hackathon. So that was my main objective at the time. And I didn't have a good way to actually get my feet wet on my own, because it just seemed so daunting. But at the hackathon, there were enough co-heroes and folks who were working on the same thing that I was able to get the help that I needed. So I felt that was a value proposition for me, and how it was able to actually come up with a prototype by the end of it. Since that year, I now am a staff faculty at a large healthcare center, and we have residents and trainees that also go to SIIM. And for them, I think sometimes it's a way to get exposed to more technical side of things. A lot of the trainees have ideas, they kind of know what the standards are, but they wanted a way to contribute and build on an idea they had and know what it takes to go from idea to prototype.
I have a question. Like, I've seen a lot of really, really great ideas and the beginnings of some solutions. Have you guys noticed any vendors taking some of these ideas and running with them, or have any teams been approached by vendors to work on collaboration to bring product to fruition and to market?
No. I know that actually the first year when we did the Slack bot for basically displaying images out of DICOM Web API, it wasn't from vendors, actually. It was from our own hospital. Some of the radiologists there, hearing about it, wanted it for us to get time to actually work on it and implement it. Unfortunately, Slack and HIPAA compatibility, it just wasn't there at the time, and it never came to fruition. But for the most part, I would imagine if vendors did see these things and got ideas from it, they'd be very hush-hush about it.
There are several interpretations of what happens downstream of hackathon. So it could very well be that the hackathon teams and the vendors happen to have very similar ideas because it's a real need in the market. So for example, data capture from non-radiology sources, i.e. enterprise imaging, is clearly not a hackathon only idea. But today, right, you can, through vendor products, you have the ability to ingest a huge variety of data formats and data types that are sourced from video captures that, on a camcorder, all the way to an existing sort of DICOMized format at a point of care ultrasound, for example. So those are, I would say if you go back enough years, there were folks that were talking about it in a hackathon. One of the winners of the hackathon over the past years came up with the concept of an integrated patient view that does a variety of body parts across modalities, integrating enterprise imaging and radiology. And today, there are some products that are available that does that. Whether it's a concept, in my personal opinion, is that was an excellent idea and concept, and multiple people probably had similar goals. And what the hackathon might have done is to convince some of the vendors that, wow, like this really is a real market need. And that idea, one of our engineers had thought about, or one of our product pitch folks have thought about, maybe that's worth pursuing. And so maybe that, maybe it's a little bit more complex than person A came up with a brand new concept that no one else has seen before. We all know that, good artists imitate and great artists steal, right? So this is something that hopefully the hackathon is meant to be for.
Yeah, it's almost like looking at Kickstarter to see the ideas and what problems are out there and potential solutions. I mean, that's one of the reasons I look at it. I don't necessarily buy into a lot of this stuff, but apparently wallets are a really big problem. Who'd have thunk it? But let's. You wanted to follow up on some of this as well?
Yes, I'd like to make a plug for the enterprise imaging efforts, the new work groups, one of which I'm co-chairing with Chris Roth on multimedia interactive reporting. And the way I see it relating to the hackathon is the focus on standards and interoperability, DICOM Web and FHIR. And I liked the comments about spectating. My first few years, I was just learning the language, how to spell FHIR. I was spelling it the wrong way my first year. Then I said, well, what's that H doing in there? And then things like that. But the enterprise imaging efforts, such as ours, we have every specialist that has imaging either central to their specialties, such as dermatology, ophthalmology, pathology, visible light types of specialties. We're looking at bringing all these into some central imaging system, whether it be PACS or virtual neutral archive. A couple of the things I was going to mention is the fun and the interactivity, and folks like Terry Sippel-Smith, who I learned didn't lend us Arseny. Arseny was discovered by Diego, but however that happened, it doesn't matter. But I wanted to mention her because of her ability to kind of make connections, such as the Arseny with Thomas Sullivan and the soulmate connection there, and the fact that they have T-shirts, that kind of spirit, the orange T-shirts that were shown everywhere.
One thing I'd like to add as far as the question of what's the purpose of the hackathon. So the purpose of the hackathon isn't so much to incubate new technology as much as it's to showcase new technology. So that really translates to two things. First of all, we are, at the end of the day, part of SIIM, and SIIM, as you know, is a very educational, collaborative community, and the hackathon is a reflection of that. So the hackathon is perfectly wide open for people who just simply want to learn or experience something. So like I said, it's perfectly okay if somebody shows up to the hackathon only for the purpose of trying to get their hands a little dirty with, things like FHIR, DICOM Web, Sol, and maybe other standards that will feature in the future. We're not necessarily expecting everybody who comes to the hackathon to compete and participate that far. It's perfectly okay. That being said, for the people who do choose to create projects and do the showcase, again, the hackathon isn't necessarily looking to incubate technology, but rather just showcase, feature that technology. We highly encourage the majority of our participants to open source their projects when they're done with them for the benefit of the wider community. And a lot of them have done that in the past. We, the Hackathon community, are big fans of open source software. We consume a lot of it, and we like to be able to kind of give back to the community. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to add is that also we generally get very consistent participation from the vendor community, both from big player vendors as well as like little startups. So for example, the gentleman that Howard mentioned, Manubu, is actually at the time was working on a startup. I don't know if he's still doing that or not, but he was there to actually do some improvements to his product to make it Fire compatible or DICOM web compatible. And we've seen the same thing happen with other vendors as well.
So I've got a couple questions to ask out of that, Mohanad. It sounds like, a working product is not necessarily the end goal here, but are any of these projects still in development? Since you did mention that they're, supposed to be open source, are they still in development, or did they ever reach production that you know of? And then the other question I was going to ask was, what is the general time commitment if, a clinician, let's say, wants to walk in and just join a team? Is it just a couple hours on the front end and then they get to go enjoy the meeting? Or is it really expected that they spend much of the meeting with the team guiding development?
Yeah, thanks, Arjun. So that's a very good question. So I'll start with the last part about time commitment. The time commitment is really up to each individual and the teams, of course. So the teams self-organize themselves. We do not impose or require anybody to be there a certain time of the day. Now, of course, also will probably depend on the type of team, the size, the diversity of their skills. So there's no real answer, but if you're part of a bigger team and you're only kind of giving your input, you probably could just get away with like texting back and forth throughout the day as you coordinate your efforts. Or, if you're actually there looking to do some programming yourself, then you probably need, maybe a couple hours every day. It really just depends. So you can kind of stretch it either way depending on how you like. Arjun, I actually managed to forget the first part of the question. Oh, yeah, I remember now. It was about projects that have made it out. I can't answer this with a high degree of certainty because, to be honest, we haven't necessarily followed up with everybody who comes to the hackathon to see where they took their prototype. But sort of a general blanket statement I can give is, like I said, we have vendors who come to the hackathon, participate, and they come to generally enhance their products and enhance their experiences. So I'd imagine a lot of these enhancements have made into their products into the real world. But, obviously we can't really ask about the specifics because, some of that could be secretive information within our organization. We have had startups that have come to the hackathon trying to integrate their products and kind of enrich it with, Fire and DICOM. We've also had some open source projects that have blossomed out of the hackathon. One example I like to give is something that the UCSF team built with the RSNA image sharing network, which is the DICOM RS broker. So this is a broker that you can put in front of your old school packs to make it DICOM web enabled. Now, this one here actually started as an idea at the hackathon that was built by a completely different team. In parallel, the RSNA image sharing team was thinking about doing something like that. But when they heard about the hackathon project, they reached out to us and kind of compared notes so they could take whatever lessons were learned at the hackathon and apply it to their example. And there are other examples, but I don't necessarily want to drill through all the examples right now. One thing I did also want to mention is that some of the participants we have at the hackathon are also from provider institutions. Like, for example, RSNA comes from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We've had teams from the Cleveland Clinic and so on and so forth. A lot of times these teams will take back their learning and apply it to their day-to-day problems, whether they productize it or just, apply it into their environment. Again, we don't necessarily stay up close following up with the details, but I know certainly the outcome in a lot of cases lives on.
Wondering if you could shed some light on how scope is defined when the projects are getting built. I can imagine it would be easy to have a lot of scope creep, and then all of a sudden you're trying to tackle something that just would not be achievable within the set time within the SIIM Hackathon. So can someone shed some light on that?
So the projects that I've done at the hackathon, I've been pretty conscious of scope creep, I guess. I mean, I usually come in with a very specific goal of wanting to have at least something coded and demoable. I think it just comes from what I have to do in my job. So I'm also kind of very conscious of scope creep in general, just because it constantly comes up. But it is something that you really have to spend not a lot of time thinking about, but you have to be very conscious of, because again, you only have basically 2 days to write the whole thing. And any amount of extra work might mean that you don't really have you'll just have to talk about the project instead of being able to show it, because unfortunately all the pieces don't come together in the end. That being said, I really admire some of the projects that are demoed at SIIM where they just kind of like from the get-go kind of like toss out the idea of scope and just say, no, we're going to shoot for the moon. And instead just kind of like discuss, like, based on what they've seen here at the hackathon and what other teams have been working on or what the presenters have shown, this is an idea that we've come up with. We can only really show you it in pictures and examples, but can you only imagine if we were able to have something like this, if we were really able to leverage some of the tools that are being demoed here? But that is, to be honest, that is not really my style so much. I would usually try and focus on something much more narrow that I actually codable in a 2-day period, short 2-day period, 48-hour period.
If I may chime in a little bit and add to Arseni's comment, I think some of it also depends on what you hope to get out of the hackathon coming in. I feel like most people, at the end of the day, your presentation, if you want to do the showcase, it's going to be ad hoc and you're going to like come up with whatever you're trying to say, maybe, the day of or the day before. But at least for me, I'm always coming to the hackathon thinking I want to get X, Y, Z done by the time I leave. And that X, Y, Z could very well be I want to join a team and learn about X. So in this case, for the 2016 competition, I wanted to get my feet wet about DICOM Web, and the fact that there was something to present was actually purely serendipitous. Yeah, and some folks, it might be that your goal for coming out of hackathon may be that you want to make you want to have a workable prototype of something, even if it's a concrete, narrow idea. And for others, it could be that you want to use hackathon as a way of brainstorming. I know there's a few teams from this past year and the year before really wanted to spend most of their time sort of brainstorming concepts and getting validation on the concept from the folks that were walking by. And maybe it's exactly what Mahat is describing. Like, it may not be that you produce something that works by the end of the day the same way that other hackathon outside of SIIM would be structured, but they got what they wanted by the end of it. So then that was beneficial.
All right. Thank you guys so much for all your answers here and sharing your experiences with us. I just want to close out by asking, for the very first project or the project you came here to talk about today, what did you go into it hoping to get out of the experience? And were you surprised by anything you got out of it on the, once it was completed? Les, why don't you go ahead and start?
Okay. Yeah. What I was hoping for with the meeting was actually mostly to introduce my son, Lucas, to the hackathon. He's interested in bioinformatics and now getting accepted to colleges for bioengineering. And previous years, I had thought about how fun it would be for him watching the Marquette students and the other colleges that were participating in universities and centers. So I just expected for him to just see how it happens. I was grateful to see that he got connected with one of the Marquette teams, the Forums on Fire. And as far as how we got together was magical, as I'd mentioned before, for Paxman. Yeah, I was very surprised that how well that took off, how fast Arseny and Alejandra could put that together for a live demo that we were all pleasantly surprised came all together. And for the demo to show the smartphone being connected to the laptop, being projected to the projector and recorded, and also how it integrated with Soulmates and the Soul being able to push the events forward. That was a big surprise to me, although I now see that they had the know-how to do it, but that was really a magical moment for myself.
I would say for me, to be honest, mostly I come to the hackathons because I find them a lot of fun. There's something kind of very exciting to just throw yourselves into 48 hours of trying to build something from nothing with a kind of guided direction, but largely you're free to do whatever you really want to. And that is probably the biggest reason I honestly come back to the hackathon. If I didn't find them as enjoyable, as fun as they were, then I would have stopped doing them a long time ago. And also, it's just a great opportunity, I've found at least, to really meet and get to know people at the conference in ways that, the talks or like the lessons don't provide. Because this is kind of a case where everybody's thrown into the same trench and you have to figure it out together. And that can kind of, make some really honest, some earnest connections between people. So that's kind of what I've always valued the most out of the hackathon process.
For me, I think what I initially entered a hackathon for that project, just wanted to almost just learn a few things about DICOM Web. I wanted to write a few lines of code. I'm not a professional coder. I wanted to write a few lines that can allow me to just get a better understanding of the standard. I didn't know much about DICOM Web, or FHIR. And to the extent that these are important in radiology and imaging informatics, I want to learn a few things about it. I've been very surprised by what comes out of it to this day. That was a goal going in, and what ended up happening was, building a project out, presenting in front. I think I remember being hesitant to actually make a presentation, and it took me a while to tell Mahan, and I'll do a showcase. And then since then, I've gotten a lot more involved in the hackathon process, and now joined a committee at SIIM. I participate by hosting the hackathon showcase for the past few years, and now DICOM is a very important part of my job. Since the time I was at SIIM Hackathon 2016, finished training. I was a trainee. I finished training. I've gone through a clinical imaging informatics fellowship because of a lot of interest in this area. And now I basically talk about DICOM headers every day and still think about the hackathon experience periodically. And so I think the biggest thing that surprised me about that year is that it kind of kickstarted a lot of interest for me in an area that I didn't think I would be all that excited about. I was always more interested in sort of SQL Server, building an application, sort of innovation type of work in informatics. But the standards part of it was something that came out of Hackathon.
Thank you guys all so much for joining us.
And thank you to the host for your time. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
SIIMCast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics in Medicine. Please visit our website at SIIM.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at SIIM_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.